Hey guys, and welcome back to the third devlog of my game, Dungeons of Oblivion. It's been a while since the last devlog, and because of that, I've gotten quite a bit of work done. In this time, I've been able to get the first dungeon, which I'm just going to call the tutorial dungeon, done. In the background of the past devlogs, I've also been working on creating the rooms for the dungeon and just coming up with how I want the tutorial dungeon to look. And I think I've gotten to a point where I'm comfortable with calling it done. Maybe if you guys have any ideas that I could do to change it or add to it, I'll come back to it and move things around or add some things. But other than that, I think I'm done with it. Now that being said, I'm only done with the aesthetics of the dungeon. I still have a lot of things I need to implement into the dungeon, like enemy spawning, the quest system for what classes you're going to play as, and other things like that. But like I said, I've made all the rooms and put them in place. And to give you an idea of what they are, I'll list some of them off to you. There is a furnace room, storage room, laboratory, torture room, prison room, barracks, and a few custom ones I made where you can find, I guess I'll call it rarer classes, assuming that people won't find them right away. I also started planning on where I wanted enemies to spawn and what kind of enemies I wanted to spawn in what places. So I placed some of them around to try and get a feel for that. And speaking of enemies, the next thing I worked on for this devlog is the enemies themselves. I wanted to make the enemy AI a little bit better. What I had worked well for a rough start and idea for the behavior, but as I started to try and build the state machine out more for the enemies, I started to run into more and more problems. And I kept having to implement a lot more things in order for it to work how I want. I thought for a while and kept trying things to make it work, but in the end, I decided that state machines aren't going to work out well for what I want for the enemies. Whether I'm just not doing things right, I don't know, but I decided to change from using a state machine to a behavior tree, which I had talked about in the first devlog. So I went to the Unity asset store and downloaded this behavior tree asset. And if you also want to get this asset, I would recommend getting the movement pack with it. It makes things a lot easier for making enemies chase the player or just wander around, plus a lot of other things. So after importing the behavior tree, I got to work learning and figuring out how to use it. I watched tutorials to get a better idea on how it works, but unfortunately I haven't seen many tutorials on YouTube for this specific behavior tree. So it's a little more difficult to get started. But I watched a few and got a basic understanding for how some of the things work in it. And the first thing I started to work on for the behavior tree is the enemies actually seeing the player. And I was able to find this on a YouTube video, and it can be a little confusing to look at, so I'm going to try and walk you through this. But you have this can see object here, where you can specify what you want the target to be for it to look for and everything. And I had a problem where it would not work no matter what unless I clicked on this use target bone feature, and then I had to select a target bone. That is the only way I could get it to work, and I'm not really sure why, but just in case you guys try and do this, you might have to do that as well. So I have it so it will look for a player within this field of view here. If I turn gizmos on, you can see if the player comes within this yellow spot and it matches that tag and the layer mask, then it will grab that, and I created a variable here, global variable, a game object, and I just called it player. And here under returned game objects, you can just select that, and so then if it sees that object, it will put it inside of that variable, which you can then select in other nodes for the behavior tree. But getting back to the behavior tree itself, I have this can see game object node, and how it works is in this thing called sequence is it will run everything from left to right, like as if you were reading. If it returns a success, so like you see how there's this green check mark here, that means it succeeded. So I have to invert the results of the can see game object, so it will then move on to the next sequence in, well, the sequence. If it returns a failure, then it leaves this sequence and goes on to the next one. So if I go here, come in as the player, and I go over to this enemy here, try to avoid the others. You can see that the can-see game object, the can-see node returns true. So then it will exit this sequence because it then makes it false. This returns false, so it leaves the sequence. Since this succeeded, it moves on to the next one here because it's doing the opposite of what this returns. So it then moves here, and this is where it then starts to chase the player. So again, we have an inverter here, so if it's not chasing the player, or in this case, if it's not within this certain distance, this will return false, which will cause this to return true, and it will move on to the next sequence. Because the sequence needs to return true for it then to move on to the next one. If it doesn't, then it will stay here until it returns true. So it will come down into here. I have it so if for some reason the enemy was attacking and the player moves away, or blocking in this case, it will stop that and will then start chasing after the enemy. It'll say, is the player within this distance? And this is where that variable here of the player can get used. If this player is within this distance, then start the running animation and then chase the player, and you can set that as the target down there. And then if the player, once this pursue node finishes, like if it arrives within, I have it set here 3, so if it reaches a distance of 3 from the player, it will then move down here. It will double check to see if it's within the correct distance. It will stop the running animation, and then I have a random sequence node, which basically means it will choose one of these two sequences to play at random. So I have it so it will just randomly block or randomly attack, and they're basically the same. The blocking, I have it set to if a bool is set to let that enemy know that it is able to block. If it's not able to block, then it will not play this. Otherwise, if it can block, it will just start blocking and wait for a random amount of time. And then attacking, it will, if it is blocking, the enemy will stop, wait a second, and then attack the player, and then wait a few seconds again, and then it will choose another random sequence. If the enemy is pursuing the player, and the player gets a certain distance away, then this within distance function node will return false, which will then cause this, because of the inverter, to return true, and it will move over to this other sequence, which just tells the enemy, basically think of it as, okay, it's not within this distance, come here, sets the animation to a sprinting animation, and just calls the pursue node again. And I have it set to the speed to be faster too. And that's basically the gist for this behavior tree. It is a little confusing, and I don't know if I did the best job explaining it, but that's basically how it works. And I have it set so these variables here, after Visual Studio loads, you can actually grab those variables, the ones here. You can grab them by using behavior designer.runtime, and you just need to specify a behavior tree. Then you just call behavior tree. You just call on the behavior tree get variable, give it the name, and then just set the value to whatever value you want it to be. And that's basically how I got through to making this behavior tree and to get it working how I want. The last thing I did for this devlog is I made a grass shader and created a new main menu. I think it turned out pretty well, and I like how the grass looks and how you can see the wind blowing and moving the grass. I also made a water shader for the other thing I worked on, which is the player's base camp, the place you'll come to after each dungeon where you can sell the items you've gotten, buy new ones, and many more things. And that's all I've gotten done these past weeks for Dungeons of Oblivion. I hope you guys enjoyed, and remember to leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next devlog.